When you think of the most valuable companies in the world, you probably think of companies like Apple, Amazon, or Microsoft. But for most of the last 2 decades, none of those companies were even close to being the most valuable company in the world. That's because that title was held by a company that many people haven't heard of. It's a company that has been quietly influencing the world's superpowers and your daily life more than any other company on the planet. The year is 1914. World War I was underway with the Allies facing off against the Axis powers. But right when that war began, the Allies knew they had one key advantage. You see, this was right around the time of the mass production of combustion engine vehicles. So what that meant was that this was going to be the first war that featured motorized transportation vehicles, tanks, armored cars, planes, ships, trucks, and trains, many of which relied upon one resource: oil. And fortunately for the Allies, they had disproportionate control over the world's oil supply. In fact, the Axis powers controlled only 3% of the world's oil at the time, while the Allies controlled about 90% of the world's oil supply. And of that 90%, almost all of that was controlled by the United States, or more specifically, one giant oil company that was just recently broken up called Standard Oil. So in a sense, Standard Oil was able to help swing the tides of World War I by supplying Britain, France, and eventually the Americans with all of the oil they needed to maintain a strong military force, while abstaining from trade with that of the Axis powers. And it was this act of supplying the Allies with oil that made businesses and world leaders around the globe realize that whoever controlled the world's oil could control the world's balance of economic and militaristic power. So began the age of oil exploration. So a few years later in 1922, a New Zealand military engineer named Frank Holmes thought that the Middle East could be a good place to look for potential oil deposits, as no one had actually bothered to look for oil there yet. So he was eventually able to get some support from the King of Saudi Arabia, and by 1924, he had found no signs of oil anywhere. But he persisted. He soon got approval to search for oil in Bahrain. He then got funding from an American company called SoCal, which was a branch of the American company Standard Oil. And in 1932, after 10 long years of looking for oil in the Middle East, the New Zealander and SoCal had finally found oil. And because of this success, SoCal was able to strike a deal with Saudi Arabia in order to explore the rest of the country for more oil deposits. And so the search continued, but they didn't really find much over the next 2 decades or so, and the oil exploration in Saudi Arabia was starting to lose some steam. In fact, SoCal had sold off a large portion of its Saudi Arabia oil business to other American companies like Texas Oil and Standard Oil of New Jersey. And by the way, it's worth noting that at this point, that Standard Oil of California, Texas Oil, and Standard Oil of New Jersey would soon change their names to Chevron, Texaco, and Exxon. And then eventually these companies decided to change the name of their Saudi Arabian branch to Aramco. Now, by 1949, Saudi Arabia looked like it might not have as much oil as Aramco thought. And after the passing of World War II and the resurgence of the importance of oil in warfare, Aramco looked like they may never find what they were truly looking for in the Middle East. But then the 1950s happened. And on one fateful day in 1951, Aramco discovered the largest offshore oil field in the world in the Persian Gulf. 6 years later, the company discovered the largest onshore oil field in the world, called the Ghawar oil field. And this was when things started to change for Aramco and Saudi Arabia. You see, at this point, Aramco was still largely owned by American companies, and so they split the profits with the Saudi Arabian government roughly 50-50. But over the next few decades, as more and more oil was discovered in the area, the Saudi Arabian government wanted full control over the oil production that occurred in their territory. So in 1976, the Saudi Arabian government bought out 100% ownership of Aramco, which was quickly becoming one of the largest oil companies in the world, and now it was state-owned. But Saudi Arabia and Aramco didn't just want to be one of the biggest oil companies in the world, they wanted to be the titan of the entire industry. So they kept expanding their oil industry and luckily by 1990 their wish would start to come true. They discovered several other large oil fields between 1988 and 1990, while also being the beneficiary of the Gulf War in Iraq. Now, essentially during the Gulf War, Aramco was contracted by the United States, the UK, France, Egypt, and Kuwait to provide all of the oil that they would need during the Gulf War. And this act single-handedly increased Aramco's oil production by 50% overnight and helped make them one of the biggest players on the global stage. But it was during the late 1990s and early 2000s where Aramco would begin to make history. You see, just to the east of Saudi Arabia was a ton of growing nations that were in need of a much larger oil supply. Japan, China, India, and many other Asian nations began buying and importing oil from Saudi Arabia in large quantities in order to help meet their oil needs. And this was the final straw for Aramco making history. By 2005, Saudi Aramco not only became the largest oil company in the world, but it became the most valuable company on the planet, with a valuation of $781 billion at the time. So why didn't you know about this? Well, the main reason was because Saudi Aramco was not listed on the public stock market, so it didn't really get too much coverage in the Western world. But soon, that would change. You see, from 2005 onwards, Saudi Aramco would quietly hold the title as the world's most valuable company, and eventually that reached the public's attention in 2019. That's because the Saudi Arabian government decided to put up about 1.5% of its Saudi Aramco business up for sale on the stock exchange. When it went public, Saudi Aramco immediately broke the record for being the largest IPO in history, and by December of 2019, Aramco was valued at $1.88 trillion, making it the most valuable company in the world, more than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, or any other company. Now, on its surface, to some of you, this just might seem like a large energy company that you might consider investing in. But in reality, what this really means is that one state-owned energy company has disproportionate control and power over the energy supply of many other countries around the world. Let's just take a look at a country like Japan. Japan is a developed nation that is still fairly wealthy, whose largest source of energy is oil. Yet 40% of all oil that gets used on Japanese land comes from Saudi Arabia. So in a sense, Saudi Arabia controls the main energy supply for the entire nation of Japan. And this story is quite similar for countries like Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, South Africa, and Brazil, all of which get at least 35% or more of their energy supply from Saudi Arabia. Then we also have the biggest customers of Saudi Arabia and Saudi Aramco. China is actually the second largest buyer of Saudi oil after Japan, as China bought $30 billion worth of oil from Aramco last year alone. And let's think about that for a second. The second largest customer for Saudi Aramco brought in more revenue than the entire annual revenue for Tesla. And then we have other countries that are highly reliant upon Saudi oil like South Korea, India, Singapore, and France. But there are two other countries on this list that are large customers of Saudi Aramco's oil that might actually surprise you. And those countries are the United States and Canada. Now, the reason why this is surprising is because the United States and Canada are both extremely large oil producers, and in fact produce enough oil to be completely self-sufficient. So then, why did the United States and Canada collectively buy $25 billion worth of Saudi Aramco's oil last year alone? Well, all we have to do is take a look at a map. In Canada, for example, the vast majority of Canada's oil production occurs in the province of Alberta. So if you wanted to get oil from Alberta to an eastern province like Newfoundland, you would need to put that oil onto a Trans-Canada oil pipeline that travels from Alberta to southern Quebec. Then you would need to unload that oil onto a series of trains that would travel to the Atlantic Ocean. Then you would need to unload that oil from the trains onto ships in order to traverse the ocean. Then you would need to unload that oil from the ships and most likely put it back on a train before finally arriving at its destination after nearly a 6,000 kilometer trip. And keep in mind that this is the most efficient path to get oil from Alberta to Newfoundland. A lot of the times, trains are used instead of the Trans-Canada Oil Pipeline, which would make this shipment of oil even more inefficient than it already is. So in a sense, even though Canada is a large oil producer, its lack of pipelines to eastern provinces makes oil delivery and transportation extremely inefficient. But even if there was a better infrastructure for oil transportation, the oil would still need to travel about 6,000 kilometers by land, which is about the same distance from the Mediterranean climate of Portugal to the frozen tundra of Siberia in Russia. And so after saying all of this, it is actually more efficient and cheaper to buy and transport oil by sea from Saudi Arabia than it is to transport it by a series of pipelines, trains, and ships internally within Canada. And by the way, this is the exact same reason why the United States buys Saudi Arabian oil. Texas and North Dakota produce the majority of oil for the United States. Yet because these states are far away from the coastal states, in many cases it is more efficient to import oil from Saudi Arabia than it is to transport it domestically. Now the point here is that even oil-rich countries are still partially reliant upon Saudi Aramco's oil in order to get their energy supply. And here is why this is important. Because Saudi Aramco is so big and influential, it has disproportionate power over other countries' economies and energy supplies. I mean, let's remember what happened earlier this year. Yes, the pandemic caused oil companies around the world to take a large financial hit. That was thanks to a decrease in transportation usage. But remember, Saudi Aramco didn't like that Russia was overproducing oil. So Saudi Aramco single-handedly tanked the world's oil prices and made the Russian ruble fall 7% in one single day, while also forcing many oil companies around the world to go into bankruptcy. And the only reason it was able to do this was because of its economic power. And just to put in perspective how large Saudi Aramco is, the company is still worth today around $2 trillion despite the oil slump and the pandemic. For reference, the largest American oil company, which is Exxon, is worth only about $174 billion today, which is less than 1/10 that of Aramco. Now, one thing that is worth noting is the future of Saudi Aramco and the oil industry as a whole. You see, while most of the public has been caught up in investing in EV companies, renewable energy sources, and, well, just green energy companies in general, the demand for oil tells a different picture. You see, the oil demand globally is still rising pretty much everywhere except for some parts of Europe. And there are a few reasons for this. One of which is that the global population is still growing, therefore there will just be more people that need oil. Another is that globalization has actually caused an increase in global oil demand due to an increase in oil consumption from planes, trains, and ships. And lastly, many of the world's economies are coming out of poverty and turning into more developed nations that need oil. The best examples of this are China, India, and the continent of Africa. And if this trend were to continue for the next few decades, you can expect Saudi Aramco to continue to expand its energy empire into these new developing economies and further cement its status as the world's most powerful and influential company. But there is something that might change that. You see, there's a piece of technology that has quietly been worked on for the last few decades that might be the new energy source of the future, and it's probably not what you might think. Because it's an energy source that was once thought to be science fiction, but now looks like it might become a reality. And with the backing of countries like the United States, South Korea and its new technology may be putting an end to the Saudi Arabian energy empire. But that will be the story for my next video. Now, if you liked this video, please leave a like, a comment. What do you think of all of this? Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to see my next video when it comes out. And lastly, please check out my documentaries playlist as it has a ton of other videos just like this on there. So make sure to click on my next video and I'll see you guys there in just a few seconds.